Uh-oh, said Ron in silence. The nose of the car dropped, and they were falling, gathering speed, heading straight for the solid castle wall. No! Screamed Ron, swinging back the steering wheel around. They missed the dark stone wall by inches as the car turned in its great arc, soaring over the dark greenhouse, and then the vegetable patches, and then over to the black lawns, losing altitude all the time. Ran out, let go of the steering wheel completely, and pulled out his wand out of his back pocket. Stop! Stop! He yelled, whacking the dashboard and the windshield. But they were still plummeting to the ground, flying towards them. Watch out for that tree! Harry bellowed, lunging for the steering wheel, but too late. Crunch! With that ear-splitting bang of metal and wood, they hit the thick tree trunk and dropped to the ground with a heavy jolt. Steam was billowing up from the tree in the crumpled hood. Hedwig was shrieking in terror. A golf ball-sized lump was throbbing on Harry's head where he had hit the windshield, and to his right, Ron let out a low, desperate groan. Are you okay? Harry asked urgently. Me want my wand, said Ron, shaky. Look at my wand. It had snapped almost in two, the tip of it dangling limply, held by a few splinters. Harry opened his mouth to say he was sure that they would be able to mend it at school, but that he never got started. At that very moment something hit the side of his car with the force of a charging bull, sending him lurching sideways into Ron, and just as a really heavy blow hit the roof. What happened? What's happened? Ron gasped, staring through the windshield, and Harry looked around at the time to see the branches as thick as a python smash into it. The tree they had just hit was attacking them. The tree was bent almost doubled, and gnarled boughs were pummeling each inch of the car, and as it could reach. Ah! Said Ron, and another twisted limb parched through the large dent in the door. The windshield was now trembling under the hail of blows from the knuckle-like twigs and the branches, and the shriek of the battering ram was pounding furiously on the roof, which seemed to be caving. Run for it, said Ron, shouted through the full weight against the door. But the next second he had been knocked backward into Harry's lap by a vicious uppercut from another branch. We're done for, he moaned, and the ceiling sagged. But suddenly the floor of the car was vibrating. The engine was restrained. Reverse! Harry yelled, and the car shot backwards. The tree was still trying to hit them. They could hear its roots creaking as it almost ripped itself up, launching at them, and they opened out as they went out of reach. That, panted around, was a close call. Well done, car. The car, however, had reached the end of the tether. With two sharp clunks the doors flew open, and Harry felt his seat rip aside sideways. The next thing you knew, it was sprawled out, damp on the ground. Loud thumps told him that the car was ejecting their luggage from the trunk. Hedwig's cage flew through the air and burst open. He rose out of it with angry screech and sped off towards the castle. Without a backward look, denied scratching, screaming, the car rumpled itself into darkness, its rear lights blazing angrily. Come back! Ron yelled after it, brandishing its broken wand. Dad'll kill me! But the car disappeared from view. One last snort from its exhaust. Can you believe our luck? Said Ron miserably, bending up to pick up Scabbers. Of all the trees we'd have to hit one that hits back. He glanced over his shoulder. The ancient tree, which was still flailing its branches threateningly. Come on, said Harry wearily. We better go up to the school. It wasn't at all triumphant arrival they had pictured. Stiff, cold, and bruised, they seized at the end of their trunks and then began dragging them up the grassy slope towards the great oak from the doors. I think the feast already started, said Ron, dropping his trunk at the foot of the front steps and crossing quietly to try to look at the brightly lit window. Hey, Harry, come and look. Look, it's sorting. Harry hurried over together. He and Ron peered into the great hall. Innumerable candles were hovering in the midair over long, crowded tables, making the gold plates and goblets sparkle overhead, bewitching the ceiling, which always mirrored the sky outside, sparkling with stars. There, through the forest of the pointed black Hogwarts hats, Harry saw a long line scared of first years filling in the hole. Ginny was among them, easily visible because of her vivid Weasley hair. Meanwhile, Professor McGonagall, a bespectacled witch with her hair in a tight bun, was placing the famous Hogwarts sorting hat on the stool for the newcomers. Each year, this age-old hat, parched, frayed, dirty, sorted the new students into the Hogwarts houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Harry remembered putting it on exactly 1 year ago, and waiting petrified for its decision. It muttered aloud in his ear. For a few horrible seconds, he feared that he was going to put him in Slytherin, the house that turned out to be more dark witches and wizards than any other. But he had ended up in Gryffindor, along with Ron, Hermione, and the rest of the Weasleys. Last term, Harry and Ron helped Gryffindor win the House Cup Championship Cup, beating Slytherin for the first time in 7 years. A very small, mousy-haired boy, who had been called forward to place the hat on his head, Harry's eyes wandered past him to Professor Dumbledore. The headmaster sat watching the sorting from his staff table, his long silver beard, his half-moon glasses shining brightly in the candlelight several seats along. Harry saw Gilderoy Lockhart, dressed in robes of aquamarine, and there, at the end, was Hagrid, huge and hairy, drinking deeply from his goblet. Hang on, Harry muttered to Ron. There's an empty chair at the staff table. Where's Snape? Professor Severus Snape was Harry's least favorite teacher. Harry also happened to be Snape's least favorite student, cruel, sarcastic, and disliked by everybody except the students from his own house, Slytherin. Snape taught potions. Maybe he's ill, Ron said hopefully. Maybe he's left, said Harry, because he missed out on the defensive art job again. Or maybe he's been sacked, said Ron enthusiastically. I mean, everyone hates him. Or maybe, a very cold voice right behind them said, he was waiting to hear why you two didn't arrive at school on the train. Harry spun around. There, his black robes rippling in the cold breeze, was Severus Snape. And his thin man, sallow skin, hooked nose, greasy shoulder-length black hair, and at the moment was smiling in a way that told Harry he and Ron were in very deep trouble. Follow me, said Snape. Not daring to even look at each other, Harry and Ron followed Snape up the steps into the vast, echoing entrance hall, which was with flame torches. A delicious smell of food was wafting from the great hall, but Snape led them away from the warmth and the light down a narrow stone staircase that led them into the dungeons. In, he said, opening the door halfway down to the cold passageway and pointing. They entered Snape's office, shivering. The shadowy walls were lined with shelves of large glass jars, floated all in the matter of revolting things Harry didn't really want to know the name of. At the moment, the fireplace was dark and empty. Snape closed the door and looked at them. So, he said softly, the train isn't good enough for the famous Harry Potter and his faithful sidekick Weasley. Wanted to arrive with the bang, did we, boys? No, sir. It was the barrier at King's Cross. Silence! said Snape coldly. What have you done with the car? Ron gulped. This wasn't the first time Snape had given Harry the impression of being able to read minds. But a moment later he understood that Snape unrolled today's issue of the event Prophet. "You were seen," he hissed, showing them from the headline, "Flying Ford Angela mystifies Muggles." He began to read aloud. "Two Muggles in London convinced they saw an old car flying over the post tower at noon in Norfolk. Mrs. Betty Bayliss, while out her washing. Mr. Angus Fleet and Peebles reported to the police. 6 or 7 Muggles in all. I believe your father works for the Misuse of Muggle Baggage Affairs Office." And he said, looking up at Ron and smiling more nastily, "Dear, dear, his own son." Harry felt as though he had been walloped in the stomach by one of the mad tree's larger branches. If anyone found out Mr. Weasley had bewitched the car, he hadn't thought of that. "I noticed in my search of the park that considerable damage seems to have been done to a very valuable whomping willow tree," Snape went on. "That tree did more damage than we—" Ron blurted out. "Silence!" snapped Snape again. "Most unfortunately, you are not in my house, and the decision to expel you does not rest with me. I shall go fetch the people who do have the happy power, and you will wait here." Harry and Ron stared at each other, white-faced. Harry didn't feel hungry anymore. Now he felt extremely sick. He tried not to look at a large, slimy something suspended in green liquid on the shelf behind Snape. If Snape had gone to fetch Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, they were hardly any better off. She might be fairer than Snape, but she was still extremely strict. 10 minutes Snape returned. Sure enough, it was Professor McGonagall, who accompanied him. Harry had seen Professor McGonagall angry on several occasions, but either he had forgotten how thin her mouth could go, or he had never seen her this angry before. She raised her wand the moment she entered. Harry and Ron both flinched. She merely pointed it at the empty fireplace, where flames suddenly erupted. "Sit," she said. They both backed into their chairs by the fire. "Explain," she said, with her glasses tilting ominously. Ron launched into the story, starting it with the Barry at the station, refusing to let them through. "So, we had no choice, Professor. We couldn't get on the train." "Why didn't you send us a letter by owl? I believe you have an owl," Professor McGonagall said coldly to Harry. Harry gaped at her. Now that she said it, it seemed obvious thing that we should have done. I didn't think. That, Professor McGonagall, is obvious." There was a knock at the door, and Snape, now looking happier than ever, opened it. There stood Headmaster Professor Dumbledore. Harry's whole body went numb. Dumbledore was looking unusually grave. He stared down at his very crooked nose at them, and Harry suddenly found himself wishing that Ron were still be beaten up by the whomping willow. There was a long silence. Then Dumbledore said, "Please explain why you did this." It would have been better if he would have shouted. Harry hated for the disappointment in his voice. For some reason he was unable to look at Dumbledore in the eyes, and spoke instead to his knees. He told Dumbledore everything except that Mr. Weasley owned the car and bewitched the car, making it sound as though he and Ron had happened to find a flying car parked outside the station. He knew Dumbledore would see through this at once, but Dumbledore asked no questions about the car. When Harry had finished, he merely continued to peer down at them through his spectacles. "Well, go get your stuff." "We'll go get our stuff," said Ron, hopeless sort of voice. "What are you talking about, Weasley?" barked Professor McGonagall. "Well, you're expelling us, aren't you?" said Ron. Harry looked quickly at Dumbledore. "Not today, Mr. Weasley," said Dumbledore. "But I must impress upon you both the seriousness of what you have done. I will be writing to both your families tonight. I must also warn you, if you do anything like this again, I will have no choice but to expel you." Snape looked through the as Christmas had come early. Christmas had been cancelled. He cleared his throat. Professor Dumbledore, these boys have flouted the decree of restrictions of underage wizardry, caused very serious damage to an old valued tree. Surely acts of this nature. It will be for Professor McGonagall to decide on these boys' punishments, Service, said Dumbledore calmly. They are in her house, and are therefore her responsibility. He turned to Professor McGonagall. I must go back to the feast, Minerva. I've got to give a few last-minute notices. Come, Service. This is a delicious-looking custard tart that I want to sample. Snape shot a look of pure venom at Harry and Ron and allowed himself to be swept out of his office, leaving it alone with Professor McGonagall, who was eyeing them with a wrathful eagle. You'd better get along to the hospital wing, Weasley. You're bleeding. Not much, said Ron, hastily wiping the cut over his eye with a sleeve. Professor, I want to watch my sister be sorted. The sorting ceremony is over, said Professor McGonagall. Your sister is also in Gryffindor. Oh, good, said Ron. And speaking of Gryffindor, Miss Professor McGonagall said, sharply, but Harry cut in. Professor, when we took the car, term had not started, so Gryffindor shouldn't really have points taken from it, should it? He finished watching her anxiously. Professor McGonagall gave him a piercing look, but she was sure she had almost smiled. She mouthed a look less than thin anyways. Okay, I will not take points from Gryffindor, she said, as Harry's heart lightened considerably, but you will both get detention. It was better than Harry than expected. As for Dumbledore writing to the Dursleys, that was nothing. Harry knew perfectly well they're just disappointed that the Whomping Willow hadn't squashed him flat. Professor McGonagall raised her wand again and pointed at Snape's desk. A large plate of sandwiches and 2 silver goblets, a jug of iced pumpkin juice appeared with a pop. You will eat in here, and then you will go straight to your dormitory, she said. I must also return to the feast. When the door had closed behind her, Ron let out a long whistle. I thought we'd had it, he said, grabbing a sandwich. So did I, Harry taking one too. Can you believe our luck, though? Said Ron thickly through a mouthful of chicken and ham. Fred and George must have flown that car 5 or 6 times, and Muggles never saw them. He swallowed and looked at another huge bite. Why wouldn't we get through the barrier? Harry shrugged. Well, we have to watch our step from now on, though, he said, taking a grateful swig of pumpkin juice. Wish we could have gone up to the feast. She didn't want us showing off, said Ron sagely. Doesn't want people to think that we're clever arriving by flying car. When they had finished eating many sandwiches as they could, they kept refilling itself. They rose, left the office, treading the familiar path to Gryffindor Tower. The castle was quiet. It seemed that the feast was over. They walked past the muttering portraits, creaking suits of armor, and climbed through the flights of stone stairs until they reached the passage where the secret entrance was to the Gryffindor Tower. It was hidden behind an oiled painting of a very fat woman in a pink dress. Password? She said, as they approached. Harry said. They didn't know the new year's password, not having met the Gryffindor prefect yet. But help came along immediately. They heard hurrying feet behind them. They turned to see Hermione Granger. There you are! Where have you been? The most ridiculous rumor. Someone said you've been expelled for crashing into the flying car. Well, we haven't been expelled, Harry assured her. You're not telling me you did fly here, said Hermione, sounding almost as severe as Professor McGonagall. Skip the lecture, said Ron impatiently, and tell us the new password. It's Wattlebird, said Hermione impatiently. But that's not the point. Her words were cut short, however, by the portrait of the fat lady swung open, and there was a sudden storm of clapping. It looked as though the whole Gryffindor house was still awake, packed into their circular common rooms, standing on the lopsided tables, through the portrait hole to pull Harry and Ron inside, leaving Hermione scrambling after them. "Brilliant!" yelled Lee Jordan. "Inspired! What an entrance! Flying car right into the Whomping Willow. People'll be talking about that for years." "Good for you," said Fifth Year to Harry, who'd never spoken to him. Someone was patting him on the back, though. He had just won the marathon. Fred and George pushed their way through the front and crowded together. "Why couldn't we have come in the car, eh?" Ron was scarlet in the face, grinning embarrassedly. But Harry could see one person who didn't look happy at all. It was Percy. It was visible all over the heads of some excited first years, who seemed to be trying to get neat enough to start telling them off. Harry nudged Ron in the ribs and nodded in Percy's direction. Ron got the point at once. "Got to get upstairs. Bit tired," he said, and the two of them started pushing their way through the door to the other side of the room, in which led to the spiral staircase of the dormitories. "Night," Harry called back to Hermione, who was wearing a scowl just like Percy's. They managed to get to the other side of the common room, still having their backs slapped, and gained the piece of the staircase. They hurried up it, right to the top, and then when they reached the door to their old dormitory, which now had a sign on it saying "Second Years," they entered the familiar circular room with its four-poster bed hung with red velvet and high, narrow windows. Their trunks had been brought up for them and stood at the ends of their beds. Ron grinned guiltily at Harry. "I know I shouldn't have joined that or anything, but—" The dormitory door flew open. In came another second-year Gryffindor boys, Finnegan, Dean Thomas, and Neville Longbottom. "Unbelievable!" beamed Seamus. "Cool," said Dean. "Amazing," said Neville. Awestruck, Harry couldn't help it. He grinned too.